What's up, everyone? So, I've been asked that question a lot. What type would I recommend for a newcomer to start their journey into monotypes? Especially for people who are maybe familiar with competitive Pokemon or playstyles that they enjoy, but they're not sure what type would suit them and what playstyle they should kind of go for. So, today I want to kind of quickly break down the 18 types into this nice little quadrant here. I'll explain each sector in a second, but I kind of want to break down each types and hopefully maybe give you an idea of what type you might enjoy based on your playstyle. So the four quadrants I have here, we have offensive on the right. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's types that are very offensive, that want to try and knock out your opponent as fast as possible. Oftentimes they won't care about their own Pokemon, so they're willing to sack anything off they have to just to try and kind of break them down with a lot of damage. On the opposite end, we have defensive, which would be more so the preservation of your Pokemon team. Definitely your team would have to work together. If one thing falls, like your defensive core kind of falls out of line, it's very bad. So we have defensive Pokemon here, and of course the objective is always to still knock out your opponent, but it might be more slow, possibly stally, possibly status heavy teams would be more defensive. And then we have a setup up here on the top, which would be teams that want to actively set up their victory. This could be through use of entry hazards. It could be set up moves like Swords Dance, Quiver Dance, Nasty Plot, etc. Sub belly drum builds, a lot of more setup focused things like that. And of course, on the opposite, we have passive, which are teams that just naturally or inherently have these kind of capabilities to be defensive or offensive. Things like Life Orb, choice items would be much more of a passive item because it doesn't require you to set up a move in advance or necessarily set up things to get going. Now, I will also say in passives, I would consider abilities passive. So, for example, Swift Swim is a passive. Rain, Drizzle, Swift Swim would be a passive strategy, as opposed to setup, which would be more like Quiver Dance or Swords Dance or something. So, with that out of the way, let's look at the 18 types and hopefully you find one that suits you. So, we'll go alphabetically, and first up we have Bug. Now, I think Bug is definitely very heavily set up. There's a lot of setup bugs. You have things like Caesar that love Swords Dance. You have Quiver Dancing on Volcarona. You have plenty of entry hazards. You have Sticky Webs, Stealth Rocks, with things like Shuckle. You even have a lot of Spike users. There's a lot of setup involved in Bug. I think it's also a very offensive type. I don't think it can actually necessarily play defensive enough. Like, it's a pretty bad type defensively. I mean, it's not a great type offensively either, but it has some really good secondary Pokemon, and I think it definitely likes offensive. So I think it's a very heavy setup type, and honestly quite offensive too. I put it like quite high in the top right. Now, after I put everything in, I might go back and change some types, so if you want to stick around to the end to see where they actually end up in the end, definitely do that. Next up we have Dark. Again, I think Dark is definitely quite a heavy setup type. Dark definitely likes setting up things like maybe screens with Grimmsnarl. It can have plenty of prankster users, taunts to shut down opponents, setting up. As well as that, it has plenty of offensive threats like Galarian Moltres is a fantastic setup sweeper if it gets going, especially behind screens. You have things like Incineroar to pivot around nicely with parting shots, so definitely Dark does like to set up. It's quite offensive too, but not quite as offensive as Bug, I'd say. It definitely is a bit of defensive, like it does like its defensive core, like Mandibuzz and Incineroar are definitely nice defensive strategies, but definitely quite set up. I'd say maybe a bit lower than Bug in both. But yeah, still definitely a top right contender. Dragon's an interesting one. I think Dragon is definitely offensive, just out and out offensive. It's one of the most, I think, aggressive numbers go high type. I don't think there's too much defensive. There's a little bit of defensive with things like Gudra and Dragalge, but at the same time, when you know when to sack them, you know when to sack them. They're not too important for the main core of the dragon type, so it's definitely very offensive. Now, is it more setup or passive is a very tough question for me to answer because I think realistically you can do both. I think you can go like a big Dragon Dance heavy team, or you can go a big Choice Scarf or Choice Band, Choice Specs kind of heavy team. It can really go either way on the offensive spectrum. I think if I had to choose, it's a little more passive than setup. You generally have maybe one, at most two setup mons, a Komodo or maybe a Dragon Dance Dragonite, but you do love your choice specs, your choice band, your life orb, and just generally really high damage on dragons. So I think it's a bit more passive, but all in all, a very offensive type. Electric, I'd argue, is kind of similar. Now, I said earlier things like rain would be considered passive, and with electric terrain Coco, it can be very fast with things like Surge Surfer and just quite aggressive. Though it's very passive, I don't think there's a lot of setup on electric. Maybe you have the odd defog or toxic on Zapdos or the occasional Iron Defense Magnezone, but overall it's definitely quite an offensive type. It just really likes to break through your opponent. Not like super passive, but more, I think, so than Dragon would be. Now, is it offensive? Yeah, it's fairly offensive, I would say. Kind of halfway between Bug and Dark, maybe. It's not as offensive as these two, but probably a bit more offensive than Dark. You need to know when to save things like your Rotom and Zapdos to pivot around, but overall, it's just about kind of trying to kill your enemies fast with its very high speed. Fairy is one I'm not too qualified on. Now, I do think it exists in that weird... It could be either, again, passive or setup. There's a lot of terrains on Fairy, but there's also a lot of like spike setting up or screens with Klefki. I think overall it's definitely a bit more setup heavy and a bit offensive, so not terribly, I would say, into either quadrant. It's quite close to neutral. I can see Fairy being defensive or quite passive. I would say it's a bit more setup heavy just because it also does have things like Trick Room, Hatterene, but definitely a small bit on the offensive side. Now, fighting, and this should come to no surprise to anyone, is quite offensive. A little bit of setup involved, but mainly passive, I think. I'm trying to think what could possibly do setup-wise, besides maybe the occasional bulk up or like Komodo. It generally does just like hitting things with strong stab, with Moxie boosters, with Choice Scarf Terrakion, for example, so quite offensive and quite passive as well. Just a very aggressive type, if that's what you're into. Fire, again, I think is similar to Electric, though I'd argue it's a bit more offensive and a bit more passive still. Kind of maybe a weird staircase here of Electric Fire fighting. Sun allows it to be extremely offensive. It can be very strong. In the Sun, it doesn't care too much about preserving its Pokemon, besides maybe its Sunsetter and Torkoal, but even then in some matchups you don't have to. You can just kind of get your Sun up and then start absolutely blasting through your opponent. It has a small bit of setup, I suppose, because you do have to manage entry hazards quite a lot. So in regards to maybe defog or yawning on Torkoal or just trying to shut down your opponent's setup, there is a small bit of setup, but actually I think it's a bit more offensive than, a bit more passive than even Electric would be. Next up we have Flying. Flying is a weird case because I think Flying could kind of be anywhere in this list. It's such an amazingly versatile type. Like, you could see it up here, down here, up here, down here, pretty much anywhere in between. It can do a lot. I think it's actually very balanced between offense and defense, so I think it would sit right in the middle of this line here. Now, is it more setup or passive? Another good question. I would say it can be either. Maybe a little bit more passive, just because the Flying type is pretty excellent as a type. It doesn't need to set up too much to be amazing, but it definitely does have a bit of setup. Probably kind of on the same tier as Dragon setup wise. You usually have one or two setup Pokemon, but they're not necessarily integral to the team, but still quite nice. But again, I think it exists perfectly in the balance of offense and defense. Ghost, I think Ghost has quite a lot of setup, but it's also very offensive. Not a huge amount of setup. We still have things like Choice Scarf or Specs, Spectrier, who's very good. You have Blacephalon as well, who's very strong. Dragapult can potentially run Choice Item 2 if you really want to go down that route. Personally, I like setup Dragapult a bit more, so I think it's kind of like the opposite of Dragon, because it also has things like Mimikyu, where you need to Swords Dance up to kind of boost your damage, because otherwise it's a little weak, leaves a little bit to be desired on the power side. But I would say it's on the this flip side of Dragon, as it's a bit more setup than passive, but still has a good bit of passive involved. But maybe a tiny bit more defensive, just because you can run things like Corsola and Jellicent, who you need to keep alive. So yeah, definitely an offensive type. Would I put a bit more defensive? Honestly, looking at this looks wrong. I think Bug is more offensive than Ghost, so I kind of put Ghost here and bug in between that and dragon. Grass is an interesting one. Definitely could go either way. You could go like a sun sweeping offensive grass, or you can go a kind of stally entry hazard setup leech seed stally grass, which is both legitimate tactics. I would say overall it's definitely a bit more defensive, unfortunately, because defensively it actually sucks as a type, but it does have really good defensive tools. It has access to spikes when Ferrothorn, it has access to Stealth Rock, plenty of Leech Seeders, Synthesis, and even things like Ferrothorn, Iron Defense, Body Press are very strong. So I think this is kind of the first more defensive type, and it's decently setup heavy. I don't think it can survive. Actually, I think it's very setup heavy. I don't think grass can survive too much on its passive abilities, especially because it can't even passively set up sun. If it could, I could see it being a bit more passive, but as it is, you pretty much need things like Whimsicott maybe to support your chlorophyll sweepers, unfortunately. So ground type is a very offensive type. Maybe not very, it's a quite offensive type. It's very passive for sure. Once it gets its sand up, it's pretty nice to just sweep an Excadrill, though it does actually no, it's a bit more defensive than I'm giving it credit for, because it does have things like Hippo Down to try and stall with things like Toxic, Slack Off, Whirlwind, Stealth Rock shenanigans, so it has a bit of defensive nature to it. I think it's almost in the interim between setup and passive, because you do have the passiveness of Excadrill being extremely powerful in the sand, and you have Garchomp, especially once it gets a scale shot going, it can go kind of crazy. But at the same time, there is some setup involved. Things like Landorus can often use Gravity or Swords Dance Rock Polish, which is very strong. Gastrodon's also passive. Seismitoad would be maybe a bit offensive. It's a weird one. I think, again, it would sit here on the line between passive and setup, but definitely a fairly offensive type, but not super offensive. So Ice is, in theory, Ice should be super offensive, does not care passive, but unfortunately you do have to play a little defensive with Ice at times. It's almost counterintuitive, and there is some setup involved because you pretty much absolutely need your Aurora Veil. You need to get rid of hazards with things like Rapid Spin or perhaps Defog. So there definitely is a bit of setup involved, but there is also some nice passive Pokemon like Darmanitan. It just goes crazy. You can even use Choice Band Mamoswine. I personally like Choice Scarf Weavile. So those are kind of passive, but there is a bit of activeness to it as well. And it's not, unfortunately, fully offensive, because you do need defensive things like perhaps defensive Cloyster or Kyurem to take care of so many threats. Ice just isn't good enough of a type, I think, to play purely offensive into its strengths. So for that reason, there is a bit of defensiveness involved to Ice. I think kind of in between ground and dark, maybe. And is it offense? Is it passive or setup? It's a hard one to answer because it exists in both very much simultaneously. I guess it's a bit more setup than it would be passive, so I'll kind of put it here between electric and ground. I'll move those here so you can read them a bit better. Next up we have Normal. Normal is definitely a defensive type, such a fantastic defensive core in Porygon 2 and Chansey. As well as that, it's pretty passive. These things just are fat by existence. There is some level of setup involved with regards to having to heal yourself, for example using Soft Boil to recover, but overall it can just kind of sit there and wall out the opponent quite nicely. As well as that, Ditto is an extremely passive anti-setup Pokemon. So if you're fighting a very heavy setup team, maybe Dark, Ghost, or Bug for example, and they're trying to set up their sweeper, Ditto always exists as a potential reverse counter to those setups. So for that reason, I think Normal is quite defensive and quite passive. Overall, a very good type as well. Only having one weakness is pretty fantastic, especially when you can actually cover those weaknesses as well. So next up we have Poison, and to no one's surprise, Poison is super defensive. Is it setup or passive? I would say maybe a bit more setup. It does rely a lot on things like Toxic Spikes, maybe Toxic on Salazzle to slowly whittle your opponent down, so there is some element of actually actively involving yourself. It does have a regen core, which I would argue is very passive, but there is definitely setup involved. You have to sometimes kind of fish for birds with Toxapex, or perhaps knock stuff off to slowly destroy your opponent. A very defensive type, probably the most defensive overall, and I would say a tiny bit more setup than passive, but the regen core does definitely give it some points in the passive. Now, speaking of regen cores, I have Psychic, and I say regen cores because things like Slowbro and Slowking, especially the Galarian Slowking, are a really good defensive core. They have a pretty fantastic regen core there on Psychic. You have plenty of defensive options like Teleport to try and manipulate the battlefield. You can use your Psychic terrain either offensively or defensively to block things like Priority. And for that reason, I think I would actually give Psychic a little... It's quite a passive type, but also it's a little bit defensive. Not massively defensive, but I would say probably a small bit more than offensive. And just passively, Psychic is very good with its terrain, with its like counter Sash Sam, its regen users, especially Assault Vest on Slowking is super hard to break on the special side. But there is some level of setup, it's not fully passive, like perhaps you want to use a Calm Minder, maybe a Trick user or a Nasty Plot user too, though there's an argument to be made that Trick can be quite passive too, but I won't get into that detail too much. Next up we have my favorite type, the Rock type. Now I think where a lot of people might make mistakes is they think Rock is a defensive type. Unfortunately, Rock sucks defensively, and I would say it's a very heavy offensive type. Now, is it more passive or setup? Hard to say really. I think perhaps a bit more setup. This is probably the truer counter to Dragon because it does like things like Stack Attack, Trick Room, Reverse Sweeping. It has some level of burn fishing and things like Macargo or Colossal, especially against the Steel matchup. But as well as that, it is very offensive. I think playing Rock defensively is playing it wrong. You shouldn't care too much about preserving your Rock types. Just know who are your key, who are your win conditions in each matchup, and I think preserve those till the very end, and I think Rock can actually be quite a good offensive type. Next up we have Steel. So Steel is, again, I think with most of the top tiers it can kind of exist in any quadrant, but I would say Steel is definitely a bit defensive. Is it setup or is it passive? Because it has things like Melmetal, who are passive demons, who just come in and choice ban, double Iron Bash teams and completely destroy them with little counterplay. I'm not a big Melmetal fan, but it's legit, so use it away. It is very passive, but it also has some nice defensive tools. It has things like maybe Ferrothorn. It has Caesar. It has potentially Celesteela. Has some setup tools. So I'd say it's a bit in the setup side, but definitely a defensive type. It needs to keep its defensive core healthy. It needs to keep things like Heatran alive against potential fire users. It needs to keep its Corviknight or Skarmory or whatever flying or ground immunity you've chosen to use against the ground types, for example. And it is quite defensive. And it also just has some nice offensive setup tools like Iron Defense Body Press is always quite strong. And finally we have Water. Now Water is the most unique case. I said flying can pretty much exist in any quadrant. I think this is doubly so for Water. I think you can play like Stall Water, which can exist down here or up here, or you can play Offensive Rain, which can exist down here. You can even play Setup Rain. Wouldn't recommend it personally, but there is definitely some very potentially good setup tools on Rain. And for that reason, I think I can only really put Normal right here, right smack bang in the middle of the chart. And that is because it's so versatile, it can pretty much do anything. I would say if you're playing like Hyper Offensive Rain, it's probably all the way down here. If you're playing Hyper Stall, it's all the way over probably here. So yeah, it's kind of up to you. Water is an extremely versatile type. Definitely one I'd recommend to newcomers if they're interested. In fact, if you're interested in finding out what types you should play if you're completely new to the tier, I do have a video based on that I will link in the description and the end of this video, so feel free to check that out if you are new to the monotype. But this was kind of how I would break down each of the types. Let's fix it a little bit just because it looks a bit cluttered over here maybe. With things like this, I think fighting... Honestly, I think fire is a bit more offensive than even fighting. Fire is a really good offensive type. Just because sun boosts its damage so much, it's quite nice. Is it fair, Dark, to say is this far in the defensive quadrant? Probably, yeah, and it's definitely a setup heavy. Maybe just below Bug. I think Bug is one of the most wanting to set up types in the game, mainly because I think it's just not strong enough by itself to survive otherwise, which is kind of sad to say. Other than that, Poison, definitely a bit more defensive. I think Poison and Normal are two of the most defensive types in the game. Maybe Grass is a bit more defensive too, probably a bit more than Steel. Steel definitely has a bit of offense to it. So overall, this is kind of my thoughts on where I would recommend, where I kind of put generic teams of these types into a quadrant based on playstyles. If this is helpful, definitely let me know down below in the comments. If it was, I would appreciate feedback on this kind of quadrant. It's the first time I've done this style of tier list. I've done regular tier lists before, but this was quite unique. And of course, definitely let me know down below what your favorite type is, your favorite playstyle, and would you agree with the play scenes I put them in. With that, I hope you have a fantastic day, everyone. Take care, and I'll catch you next time.